The women stopped talking the moment the black luxury SUV rolled into the dusty village square. For a heartbeat, even the birds seemed to fall silent. 78-year-old Mama Amina Nelovu stepped out first. Diamonds glittered around her neck, wrists and ears, flashing beneath the afternoon sun. Her elegant dress moved gently in the breeze, and beside her stood a driver, holding the door with quiet respect. Across the square, a group of elderly women froze. Grace Mbeki dropped the basket she was carrying. Thandiwe Kumalo stared so hard her eyes watered. Nomusa Dlamini whispered, "That can't be her." But it was. 30 years earlier, Amina had left the village with nothing except a small cloth bag and a broken heart. Back then, people called her unlucky. Some called her cursed. Others were crueler. "You'll come back begging." Grace had laughed the day Amina left. "You have nothing," Nomusa had added. The words had followed Amina for decades. Now she had returned wearing enough diamonds to buy half the village. The crowd gathered quickly. Children ran from nearby homes. Men abandoned conversations. Women peeked from doorways. Everyone wanted to understand the same impossible thing. How had the poorest woman in the village become the richest? Amina slowly removed her sunglasses. Her eyes swept across the crowd until they settled on the three women who had mocked her most. For a moment, nobody moved. Then something unexpected happened. Amina smiled. Not a proud smile, not a victorious smile, a sad one, a smile filled with memories. Grace shifted uncomfortably. "Why is she looking at us like that?" she muttered. Amina reached into her handbag and carefully pulled out a faded photograph. The moment the women saw it, all color drained from their faces, because the photograph contained a secret they had spent 30 years trying to bury, and somehow Amina had brought it back with her. The village thought her return was about wealth. They were wrong. Amina had come home for something far more important. But what was hidden inside that photograph that terrified the women who once mocked her? The photograph trembled slightly in Amina Lovo's hand as she stepped toward the center of the village square. No one spoke. Even those who had arrived only moments ago could feel the tension hanging in the air. Grace Mbeki, Thandiwe Kumalo, and Nomusa Dlamini stood shoulder to shoulder, their expressions growing tighter with every step Amina took. "Amina," Grace finally said, forcing a smile, "it has been many years." Amina looked at her calmly. "Yes," she replied. 30 years is a long time to carry a lie." The crowd immediately stirred. "A lie? What lie?" The three women exchanged nervous glances. "Amina, this is not the place," Thandiwe said quietly. "No," Amina answered. "This is exactly the place." She raised the photograph high enough for everyone to see. The image was old and faded, but several villagers recognized the people in it. There was Amina. There was her late husband, Jabari Ndlovu, who had died 30 years ago. And standing beside them were Grace, Thandiwe, and Nomusa. A simple picture, yet the three women looked terrified. "What does this mean?" someone in the crowd asked. Amina lowered the photograph. "For 30 years, this village believed I abandoned my husband when he became sick." Murmurs spread instantly. That was the story everyone knew, the story everyone had repeated, the story that had destroyed Amina's reputation. "But that story was never true," Amina said. The square fell silent again. Grace stepped forward. "You should stop this." "Why?" Amina asked softly. "Because the truth hurts." Nomusa's voice shook. "People don't need to hear old stories." Amina's eyes filled with emotion. "My husband died believing I betrayed him." The words hit the crowd like thunder. For years, Amina had carried that pain alone. Now the wound was opening in front of everyone. But then she revealed something even more shocking. Before Jabari died, he left behind a letter. The three women froze. Amina held up a sealed envelope. "I found it 6 months ago." For the first time, genuine fear appeared on their faces. Because if the letter still existed, then the secret they had hidden for 3 decades might finally be exposed. But what did Jabari write before his death that made these women so afraid? What truth is hidden inside Jabari's letter? And How could it destroy the story the village has believed for 30 years? A heavy silence settled over the village square as Amina Delovu held the sealed envelope above her head. No one could take their eyes off it. For 30 years, the village had accepted one version of events. Amina had supposedly abandoned her husband, Jabari Indlovu, during the hardest days of his illness. The accusation had spread from home to home until it became accepted as fact. Now, that story stood on the edge of collapse. "Read it," a voice called from the crowd. Several villagers nodded. "Yes, read it." Grace Mbeki stepped forward immediately. No, her answer came too quickly, too sharply. The crowd noticed. Amina noticed. Amina asked. Grace swallowed hard, because reopening old wounds helps no one. Amina's eyes glistened. Old wounds never heal when they are built on lies. The crowd murmured in agreement. For years, many had judged Amina without hearing her side. Now doubt was beginning to spread through the square. Tandiwe Kumalo tried a different approach. "Amina," she said gently, "if Jabari truly loved you, let him rest in peace." The words sounded kind, but Amina saw through them. "Interesting," she replied. "You want peace today. 30 years ago, you wanted gossip." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the crowd. The three women looked increasingly trapped. Then Amina revealed something none of them expected. "The letter is not the only evidence." Gasps erupted. Grace's face turned pale. Nomusa grabbed Thandiwe's arm. "What else do you have?" Grace demanded. Amina reached into her handbag again. This time, she removed a small leather notebook. The moment the women saw it, panic flashed across their faces. Several villagers recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Jabari, his personal journal. The notebook everyone believed had been lost after his death. Amina held it carefully against her chest. "My husband wrote in this journal every day during the final months of his life." The crowd erupted into whispers. If the journal existed, then every rumor, every accusation, and every lie could finally be tested against the truth. And if the truth emerged, reputations built over decades could be destroyed in a single afternoon. But what exactly had Jabari written in his journal that terrified Grace, Sandiwe, and Nomusa so much? Amina Ndlovu looked down at Jabari's journal, her fingers trembling against the worn leather cover. For a moment, she said nothing. The village waited. So did Grace Mbeki, Thandiwe Kumalo, and Nomusa Dlamini. Their fear was obvious now. But Amina's expression held something far deeper than anger. It was grief, the kind that survives decades, the kind that never truly leaves. "When I found this journal," Amina began softly, "I thought it would finally give me peace." The crowd listened carefully, but instead it broke my heart all over again. Several villagers exchanged confused glances. If the journal proved her innocence, why would it cause more pain? Amina slowly opened it. Inside were pages yellowed with age. Jabari's handwriting covered every sheet. She turned to one marked with a folded corner. "This entry was written 12 days before my husband died." The square became silent. Amina swallowed before reading aloud. "I miss Amina every day. If she knew the truth, she would come home immediately. But they told her I no longer wanted to see her." A shocked murmur spread through the crowd. Amina lowered the journal. Tears filled her eyes. "For 30 years, I believed Jabari rejected me." The villagers stared in disbelief. That had never been part of the story. Amina had spent decades believing her husband had turned against her. Meanwhile, Jabari had spent his final days believing she had abandoned him. Both had suffered. Both had been deceived. The emotional weight of the revelation hit the crowd hard. Even some who had judged Amina began wiping tears from their eyes. But then Amina revealed something even more painful. "There is more." She turned another page. The person who kept us apart wasn't a stranger. Grace looked away. Nomusa's breathing quickened. Thandiwe's hands shook visibly. Amina's voice cracked as she spoke. "The betrayal came from someone we trusted." The crowd gasped. This was no longer a story about gossip. It was a story about deliberate cruelty. a story that had stolen 30 years from two people who loved each other. And according to the journal, the person responsible was named directly. But whose name had Jabari written on the next page? And how devastating would the truth be when the entire village heard it? The entire village leaned forward as Amina and Lovo turned the next page of Jabari's journal. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. 30 years of rumors, accusations, and heartbreak hung on a single name. Amina looked at the page for a long moment before speaking. The name written here is Grace Mbeki. A collective gasp exploded across the square. Grace staggered backward. "No," she shouted. "That is not true." But her voice lacked conviction. The villagers immediately turned toward her. For decades, Grace had been one of the most respected women in the community. She had comforted grieving families, advised young couples, and often spoken about honesty and faith. Now that reputation was beginning to crack. Amina continued reading. Grace told me Amina had chosen another life and wanted nothing more to do with me. She begged me not to send messages because she said Amina became angry whenever my name was mentioned. Silence followed. Then Amina lowered the journal. The pain in her eyes was unbearable. Meanwhile, Grace told me Jabari never wanted to see me again. The crowd stared at Grace. Their confusion quickly turned into suspicion. But then came the twist nobody expected. Grace suddenly began to cry. Not polite tears, not tears of embarrassment, the desperate tears of someone carrying a burden for years. "You don't understand," she whispered. "Then explain," Amina replied. Grace looked toward the ground. "I never wanted either of you to suffer." The villagers exchanged confused looks. Nothing about this made sense. If Grace had lied, why would she claim she was trying to help? Then Grace revealed the truth that changed everything. "I didn't create the lie." The square erupted with shock. "What?" Amina asked. Grace pointed toward Nomusa and Thandiwe. "They came to me first." Both women froze. Grace's voice shook. "They showed me documents. They convinced me Jabari was hiding something dangerous from Amina. They said separating them would protect her." The crowd gasped again. Suddenly, the story looked completely different. Grace had played a role, but she might not have been the mastermind. For 30 years, everyone had assumed the tragedy was caused by cruelty. Now another possibility emerged. What if the deception began because of a secret so serious that people believed it justified destroying a marriage? But what were Nomusa and Thandiwe trying to protect Amina from, and why had they kept the truth hidden for 3 decades? Forward-driving question. What dangerous secret did Nomusa and Thandiwe claim Jabari was hiding, and was it ever real? Or another devastating lie? People whispered, argued, and stared at Nomusa Dlamini and Thandiwe Kumalo as though they were strangers. Moments earlier, Grace Mbeki had appeared to be the villain. Now the blame was shifting, and the truth was becoming darker with every revelation. "Amina deserves to know everything," Grace said, wiping tears from her face. Nomusa's expression hardened. "No," she snapped. The sharpness in her voice shocked everyone. For the first time, she wasn't trying to appear innocent. She looked frightened, deeply frightened. Amina stepped closer. "What secret were you protecting me from?" Nomusa glanced at Thandiwe. The two women exchanged a look that carried 30 years of shared guilt. Finally, Thandiwe spoke. "We found documents among Jabari's papers." "What documents?" Amina demanded. Thandiwe swallowed. "Property documents." The crowd frowned. Nobody understood. Then Nomusa continued. "They showed that Jabari had inherited a large tract of land from a wealthy relative." Murmurs spread through the square. Land meant wealth. Even 30 years ago, it would have been valuable. Amina's eyes narrowed. "That doesn't explain anything." "No," Nomusa whispered. "It doesn't." For a moment, it seemed she might finally confess. Instead, she revealed something worse. "We lied about why we separated you." The crowd gasped. Amina felt her heart sink. Every answer seemed to create an even larger question. "What do you mean?" she asked. Thandiwe looked away in shame. "The documents weren't dangerous." Amina froze. What? They were worth a fortune. Silence, absolute silence. Then realization spread across the faces of everyone present. The women hadn't separated Amina and Jabari to protect her. They had done it because of money. But the nightmare was far from over. Nomusa began sobbing. We thought the land would eventually belong to the village council. We convinced ourselves it was for everyone's benefit. You stole 30 years from us, Amina whispered. No, Grace interrupted, her voice trembling. Not 30 years. Everyone turned toward her. There is one more thing none of us have admitted. Fear flashed across Nomusa's face. Thandiwe nearly collapsed. Whatever came next was clearly worse than everything already revealed. And if Grace spoke the final truth, there would be no hiding from it. The village square was so quiet that the rustling leaves could be heard. Every eye was fixed on Grace Mbeki. Her face was wet with tears. Nomusa Dlamini and Thandiwe Kumalo stood frozen, their fear now impossible to hide. For 30 years, they had carried a secret. Now it was finally catching up with them. Grace took a deep breath. Amina deserves the whole truth. No, but it was too late. Grace looked directly at Amina. The land was never the real reason. Amina's heart pounded. Then Grace spoke the words that shattered the last remaining lie. Jabari left everything to you. The crowd gasped. Amina stared in disbelief. What? Grace nodded. The inheritance? The land, the savings, the livestock, everything. Amina struggled to process the revelation. If Jabari had left everything to her, then why had she spent decades living in poverty after his death? The answer came immediately, because someone had stolen it. Grace pointed toward Nomusa and Thandiwe. They forged documents after Jabari died. The crowd erupted. Several villagers shouted in disbelief. Others simply stood speechless. Amina felt her knees weaken. The betrayal was far worse than she had imagined. Not only had they separated her from the man she loved, they had stolen the future he had worked to leave behind. No, Amina whispered. Tears streamed down Nomusa's face. We were wrong. Wrong? Amina cried. Her voice cracked with decades of grief. I lost my husband. The crowd fell silent. I lost my home. Silence. I lost 30 years believing the man I loved had rejected me. Many villagers began crying openly. The pain in her voice was impossible to ignore. Then Amina opened a final folder she had brought with her. Inside were official legal documents. Signed, verified, court approved. For the first time, everyone understood where her wealth had come from. 6 months earlier, investigators had uncovered the fraud. The stolen inheritance had been restored to her with decades of accumulated value. The diamonds, the luxury vehicle, the success, they all came from what had always been hers. And now the truth stood exposed before the entire village. But after all this pain, could Amina find it in her heart to do what nobody expected, offer forgiveness? The sun was beginning to set over the village square. Long shadows stretched across the ground as silence settled over the crowd. The truth was finally out. After 30 years of lies, betrayal, and heartbreak, there was nothing left to hide. Nomusa Dlamini and Thandiwe Humalo stood with their heads bowed. Neither woman could meet Amina and Lovo's eyes. The villagers waited. Everyone expected anger. Many expected revenge. Some even hoped for it. After everything Amina had suffered, who could blame her? Amina looked around the square. She saw faces filled with pity, faces filled with guilt, faces filled with sorrow. Then she looked at the two women who had helped destroy her life. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, Amina broke the silence. I spent 30 years carrying pain. Her voice was calm. I thought justice would heal me. The crowd listened carefully, but when I found the truth, I learned something important. A tear rolled down her cheek. Pain does not disappear when someone else suffers. Nomusa began crying harder. Thandiwe covered her face with trembling hands. Amina stepped toward them. You stole my inheritance. They nodded. You separated me from the man I loved. More tears. You took years I can never get back. The entire square seemed to hold its breath. Then Amina said the words nobody expected. "I forgive you." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Nomusa collapsed to her knees. Thandiwe sobbed openly. Neither woman had expected mercy. Neither believed they deserved it. Amina continued. "Forgiveness does not erase what happened." She paused. "It means I refuse to let your choices control the rest of my life." The words struck deeper than any punishment could have. For the first time in 30 years, the burden she carried seemed to lift. The crowd watched in silence, not because of the diamonds, not because of the money, but because they were witnessing something rarer, healing. The village had expected a story about wealth. Instead, they witnessed a story about truth, redemption, and freedom from bitterness. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, Amina smiled, not the sad smile she arrived with, but one filled with peace. At last she was home. Emotional meaning of the story truth eventually comes to light, even after decades of deception. Wealth restored Amina's security, but truth restored her dignity. Forgiveness was not weakness, it was her final act of strength. The greatest victory was not recovering her inheritance, but recovering her peace. Today's sorrowful and touching morals. The saddest theft is not money, it is time. Amina lost 30 years she could have spent loving her husband, all because of deception. Never build your opinion of someone on rumors. The people who judged Amina were wrong, and their judgment added to her suffering. A lie may travel for years, but the truth never stops walking. Eventually it arrives. Some people carry silent heartbreaks that nobody sees. Be kind, because you never know what pain another person is hiding. Forgiveness does not erase the past, but it frees the heart from becoming a prisoner of it. The story reminds us that love can survive separation, memories can outlive death, and truth can outlive lies. Most of all, cherish the people you love today. One day, the chance to explain, apologize, or embrace them may be gone forever, and that regret can last a lifetime. Please subscribe for more.